Here we are, continuing to read Marx on the expropriation of the agricultural population. We're on page 800 if you have the same version. The Highland Celts were organized in clans. Each of which was the owner of the land on which it was settled. The representative of the clan, its chief or great man, was only the titular owner of this property, just as the Queen of England is the titular owner of all the national soil. When the English government succeeded in suppressing the intestine words of these great men and their constant incursions into the lowland plains, the chiefs of the clans by no means gave up their time-honored trade as robbers. They only changed its form. On their own authority, they transformed their nominal right into a right of private property. So from titular right to the land, much like a queen or a king has, to a right of private property, of full ownership. And as this brought them into collision with their clansmen, resolved to drive them out by open force. So now that the clan leader owns the land as if it were private, he's driving out his own clansmen. Here's a quote from Professor Newman. A king of England might as well claim to drive his subjects into the sea, says Professor Newman. This revolution, which began in Scotland after the last rising of the followers of the Pretender, can be followed through its first phase in the writings of Sir James Stewart and James Anderson. In the 18th century, the hunted-out Gaels were forbidden to emigrate from the country, with a view to driving them by force to Glasgow and other manufacturing towns. Forced into the cities. This is why any leftist critique, right, by necessity needs to have a critique of the cities in some way. As an example of method, obtaining in the 19th century the clearing made by the Duchess of Sutherland will suffice here. Okay, the Duchess of Sutherland. This person, well instructed in economy, educated in economics, right, resolved on entering her government to effect a radical cure and to turn the whole country, whose population had already been, by earlier processes of the like kind, reduced to 15,000, into a sheep walk. Again, we have sheep. From 1814 to 1820, these 15,000 inhabitants, about 3,000 families, were systematically hunted and rooted out. Referring them to as families is correct on Marx's part, right? That's the smallest unit which a human exists, is family. Continuing on. All their villages were destroyed and burnt. All their fields turned into pasturage. British soldiers enforced this eviction and came to blows with the inhabitants. One old woman was burnt to death in the flames of the hut which she refused to leave. Wow. Could you imagine this lady refusing to leave this home where her parents and grandparents, going back forever, had lived, and being burnt to death? Thus, this fine lady appropriated 794,000 acres of land that had, from time immemorial, belonged to the clan. She assigned to the expelled inhabitants about 6,000 acres on the seashore, 2 acres per family. So they must have had access to far more than just 2 acres, right? The 6,000 acres had until this time laid waste and brought in no income to their owners. The Duchess, in the nobility of her heart, actually went so far as to let these at an average rent of 2s6d per acre to the clansmen, who for centuries had shed their blood for her family. So now you get 2 acres, but you got to pay rent. And it's not just any 2 acres, it's 2 acres by the sea where it had never been farmed, right? Full of rocks, sandy soil. Not much a way to make money on that, right? Let's see. The whole of the stolen clan land she divided into 29 great sheep farms, each inhabited by a single family, for the most part imported English farm servants. In the year 1835, 15,000 gales were already replaced by 131,000 sheep. Something rich people liked back then was sheep, far more than poor people. Well, I guess they did like poor people because they turned all the normal people, the people of the soil, the peasants, all their family members, into poor people. The remnant of the Aborigines flung on the seashore tried to live by catching fish. They became amphibious and lived, as an English author says, half on land and half on water, and withal only half on both. But the brave Gaels must expiate yet more bitterly their idolatry, romantic and of the mountains, for the great men of the clan. The smell of their fish rose to the noses of the great men, the scent of some prophet in it. Look at that, just by trying to survive here, where they couldn't farm. They had taken away everything that they had because it was so profitable. Now, the smell of the fish rose to the nose of the great men. They scented some profit in it, and let the seashore of the great fishmongers of London, for the second time, the Gaels were hunted out. Poor people, right? Probably better just to have been burnt in a hut. But finally, part of the sheepwalks are turned into deer preserves. Well, you know, rich people like to hunt. Why not destroy some more human lives so that you can have more space for your pastured deer preserves? Continue on. Everyone knows that there are no real forests in England. There hadn't been for 1,000 years. They cut all those down. Too many people, too little land. It's meant to be forest. The deer in the parks of the great are demurely domestic cattle, fat as London aldermen. Scotland is therefore the last refuge of the noble passion. In the Highlands, says Somers of 1848, new forests are springing up like mushrooms. Here on the side of Gick, you have the new forest of Glenfishie, and there on the other you have the new forest of Veraki. In the same line you have from the Black Mount, an immense waste, also recently erected. What does that mean, waste recently erected? I think there's something there. From east to west, from the neighborhood of Aberdeen to the crags of Oban, you have now a continuous line of forest, while in the other parts of the highlands there are the new forests of Loch, Archaig, Glengarry, Glenmoriston, etc. Sheep were introduced into glens, which had been the seat of communities of small farmers, and the later were driven to seek subsistence on coarser and more sterile tracts of soil. Now deer are supplanting sheep, and these are once more dispossessing the small tenants who will necessarily be driven down upon still coarser land and to more grinding penury. Deer forests. And the people cannot coexist. One or the other of the two must yield. Let the forests be increased in number and extent during the next quarter century, and they have been, as they have been in the last, and the gales will perish from their native soil. This movement among the Highland proprietors is with some of matter of ambition, with some love of sport, with others of a more practical cast, follow the trade in deer with the eye solely for profit. So ambition, sport, and profit are all playing. Think about how much money poor people give today to watch NFL. Just getting poorer and poorer, living in debt so they can watch the Steelers, the Giants, the Eagles, the Rams. For it is a fact that a mountain range laid out in forest is in many cases more profitable for the proprietor than when let as a sheepwalk. The huntsman who wants a deer forest limits his offers by no other calculation than the extent of his purse. Sufferings have been inflicted in the highlands scarcely less severe than those occasioned by the policy of the Norman kings. Deer have received extended ranges while men have been hunted within a narrower and still narrower circle. One after one, the liberties of the people have been cloven down, and the oppressions are daily on increase. The clearance and dispersion of the people is pursued by the proprietors as a settled principle, as an agricultural necessity, just as trees and brushwood are cleared from the wastes of America or Australia, and the operation goes on in a quiet, businesslike way. I guess the problem with capitalism, but it's also where I don't find Marx's solution of socialism particularly usable either, because socialist communities have also been ecologically destructive in history. This is the last paragraph. The spoliation of the church's property, the fraudulent alienation of the state domains, the robbery of common lands, the usurpation of feudal and clan property, its transformation into private property under circumstances of reckless terrorism, were just so many idyllic methods of primitive accumulation. They conquered the field for capitalistic agriculture, made soil part and parcel of capital, and created for the town of industries the necessary supply of free and outlawed proletariat. Right? The poverty, transforming people into the poor was essential So, where is Marx right? Where is Marx wrong? What's your opinion? Do you believe in these big, giant, massive socialisms like the Soviet Union, or in Northern Europe, even the liberal ones are giant globalist organizations, internationalist globalists? Or do you believe that that some type of return, right? Some type of agricultural democracy, something like what Jefferson foresaw, or Thomas Paine in his Agricultural Justice, great tract people should read. Maybe I'll read that one next, I don't know. Or maybe I'll read something on Dewey. It's about 10 years since I've read some of the Dewey works, right? I was really into his educational philosophy a decade ago. Or maybe I'll read something else next. But it's a nice little way to do a series, is reading a small section and a critical section of something I've already read with a critical eye. So yeah, the idea of small property democracy would be that democracy works when more people own land, which means smaller amounts of land. So maybe 2 acres, maybe an acre, maybe 4 acres today, right? And can make some use of it. We are born, in Thomas Paine's words, to a right to the land that we didn't choose to give up, but that we need to be compensated for in some way. I get most people would rather live in the big cities, knowing nothing else. In some way, they need to have some way of property that they can, subsist. Because if you can't subsist without hand, right, without a hand up, you can't offer your labor for profit. If your labor is necessity, you can't offer it for profit. It just can't be done. If you don't have the power to offer it freely, if you need it, then you're not offering it for profit. They're going to give you as little as they can get away with. Have a blessed day.